Hare Krishna.
Jai Srila Prabhupada. So
Hi,
this is
Srila
one
Prabhupada.
of two seminars, or as much of a workshop as we can possibly do with this media, that should help you make your classes more dynamic. Basically, what you're looking for here is for people to say, wow, I'm really interested in this. This makes sense to me. This is something I can use in my life. Just like Krishna told Arjuna, you can be an instrument. So this is a very simple, elegant system by which you are acting as the via media to connect what's in the Shastra to the real lives of your audience. Prabhupada used the word transparent via media. I also think of it as a light. It's like, here's the Shastra, and what you're doing as the presenter is you're shining a light on the Shastra so that it can be understood and applied by everybody who's listening. If you don't do that, the Shastra remains something theoretical. In other words, this is how to take Shastra from Gyan to Vigyan, from a series of facts and information to realization and application. In the early days of ISKCON, Hayagriva, there weren't very many books at the time. Prabhupada he'd come with us with 3 volumes of the first canto. And so Hayagriva was interested to know more about the stories that Srila Prabhupada would tell. Now, Prabhupada would tell stories from the Bhagavatam here and there. So Hayagriva found a book written by the followers of Sri Chinmoy that gave summaries of the stories in the Bhagavatam. And Prabhupada gave a few reasons why he didn't want the devotees to use it. One, he was concerned about the interpretation and the mood of the writers. But another reason he said is we're not so interested just in knowing the story. We want to know the philosophy. In other words, we're not interested simply in being able to recite a list of facts or even a list of a plot outline. Now, we see that sometimes when devotees teach the Shastra, even in Shastra classes like Bhakti Shastri, their goal is that people memorize a whole group of facts, or that they can tell you, I can find this in this purport, etc. Now, that's certainly useful and helpful, but that is not the purpose of studying Shastra. The purpose of studying Shastra is for it to be revealed in the heart of the listeners, so the listeners can then have it real in their own life. This is a very, very simple step-by-step procedure. The procedure is simple. However, it is a skill. What we're going over today is a skill. And the only way to be proficient in a skill is to practice it. The materialists say it takes 10,000 hours of practicing a skill before one fully masters it. At least you should figure that it will take a few months of concerted practice.
Yes.
All right. Let's look at why do we learn. This relates to what I was speaking of in the beginning. Are we learning just so that we have a series of facts that we know? Just so we can say, oh, I know who said this, or is that what we mean by Shastric knowledge? I mean, how many classes do we go to where the speaker gives us information, but we don't know what to do with that information? We don't know how to make it useful. I've been in classes where people will even ask the person who's giving class, well, what can we do with this? And the person speaking says, I really don't know. So we want to go from the Shastra to how can this help me in my life? What can I do with it? And how can I use it to help others? And we can ask, what is our effectiveness in accomplishing this? You know, after people have been devotees for 10 years, how many of them are strictly following? Now, no one's done any research, any comprehensive research on this, so we really can't throw around any kind of facts and figures with any sort of authority. On a very anecdotal level, I'm often surprised at how many people are not still chanting 16 rounds, or how many people are not following the regulative principles, even though they've taken vows of initiation. It just always surprises me. I mean, one of my god sisters a few months ago told me how she asked Srila Prabhupada, how can I show my love for you? And he told her by chanting 16 rounds every day and following the principles. And I said, well, that's pretty simple. She said, yeah, but I haven't done it. So why is it that so many people, again, I don't know what the percentage is, but why are so many people having difficulty? And I believe a lot of the reason is that the people who are preaching Krishna consciousness do not have the goal of application, are not thinking, okay, how can I take this knowledge and inspire people as to seeing this knowledge active in their own life? Now, I'm just talking about big. What about small? You know, you go to a class, and in the class there's some teaching, and an hour later you're doing something else. How often does that kind of thing happen? And now these are going to be our basic axiomatic truth. We're going to call them maxims. And the first thing is that application is the main reason for getting spiritual information. Now, if we don't accept this as a truth, we can't really go on any further from here. If someone is thinking, well, the reason that we're studying the scripture is just to know the scripture, just so we can recite it. No, the reason should be a transformation of heart. What are you going to do with the scripture? On an internal level, how are you going to use that scriptural knowledge to get closer to Krishna? On an external level, how is it going to affect the behaviors? What's going to happen with your body, mind, and words from reading the scripture? Now, of course, it's interesting that scripture is not like an ordinary course. In an ordinary course, there's not really benefit from studying the information itself. It's only useful insofar as you use the information. However, studying the scripture, the very act of studying the scripture, as Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita, that one who studies this sacred conversation worships me by his intelligence. The very act of studying the scripture is itself a kind of application, because one of the things we're supposed to do is hear. However, it's hearing with rapt attention. Again, we've talked about this lately. It's the quality of the hearing. It's the quality of the hearing. And if we're presenting Shastra without any mood of application, the quality of the hearing will go down. And why is that? Very simple. We may be interested in so many things, but we're going to only be deeply interested in something that relates to ourselves. This is normal. This is natural. There's nothing wrong with that. So if we don't see the relationship of the Shastra to ourselves, our ability to deeply hear the Shastra is going to be compromised. Now, the second point, actually I give a whole seminar sometimes just on this second point. We spend one whole hour just on this second point. That whether or not your listeners apply what you teach is your responsibility, not theirs. I mean, we've had so many teachers in our lives, I'm sure, who said, my responsibility is just to give you the information. What you do with it is your business, and whether or not you do anything with it is your business. Right? We've had teachers like that. We're thinking, why are they teaching us this stuff? What am I going to do with it? How could I, even if I wanted to do anything with it, how would I do something with it? And we've asked those teachers, what does this have to do with me? And they can't answer. One thing I run into when I teach the seminar in schools, in devotional schools, is many times teachers will come up to me and say, I haven't any idea how my students are going to use this information that I'm teaching them. I say, wow. Well, then why should they be listening? All right, everybody, sit down and let me tell you something useless. Or we'll find often the teachers will look at the Shastra and say, oh gosh, I don't know what this has to do with anybody's lives. Well, if you, the teacher, don't know what it has to do with my life, how am I supposed to know? Real teaching means that real learning has taken place. Judge whether or not you're a good teacher by whether you've lit a fire in the hearts of your learners. Srila Prabhupada himself would use this as the criteria for judging the success of his preaching over and over and over again. He would say there were so many editions of the Bhagavad Gita before I came to the West, but none of them made a devotee of Krishna. That was his criteria. His criteria wasn't only I presented the Shastra in a bona fide way as it is, coming in the line of disciplic succession. That wasn't his only criteria for his success. His criteria for his success was also, what do my listeners do with what I'm teaching? How do they change? How does it affect them? Have I given them the keys for application? Now, those who study teaching techniques in our third maxim tells us that 45 to 70% of our presentation should be application. So let's say you have 1 hour to give class. Of course, with the chanting the verses and all in that, you may have 40 minutes to give class. So let's say there's 40 minutes where you're speaking. So of that 40 minutes, at least 15 minutes you should be focusing on how people are going to apply and use what you're teaching. Application has to relate to what people need. It has to relate to what people need. I can't apply something in my life if it doesn't apply to my life. And I've heard classes given by, especially, given by renunciates that just don't connect to the needs of people in the world, or vice versa. If we who are teaching lead a very insulated life, if we're not in touch with a lot of different people in a lot of different circumstances, then we may not be able to really know how to apply to the needs of people in an automatic way. Now, this is a separate seminar, how to find people's needs and how to relate to their needs, but we'll just say briefly that it's important. One has to know what people's real needs are. This takes observation, talking to people, getting to know people, getting out of our own little bubble and comfort zone, especially, and that's especially true, if the life that we lead is radically different from the lives of the people to whom we're teaching. That's especially important. We've seen some people, they've been lifetime renunciates, they've lived in an ashram, in a temple their whole life. They very rarely may even have to take care of their personal needs. Someone else does their laundry, someone else does their shopping, someone else does their cooking. They may spend 8 or 9 months a year where they don't even go into a store. They may not have to deal with close interpersonal relationships of a family on a regular basis. Most of the people who surround them consider that they're an authority. And if that's been going on for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, then it's going to be very difficult for that person to understand what are the needs of somebody who's regularly interacting with the world, who's taking care of all their own needs, who has people that they live with and interact with on a daily basis in a family-type situation. And therefore, it's very important that we be conscious of the own limitations of our vision and understanding and make a determined, concerted, purposeful effort to be in touch with what's going on with our audience. Again, I'm not going to get in that in depth on today's class. Then application has maximum effectiveness when the student sees the Shastric basis. If you just joined us, this is also a visual presentation. If you go to the website and you can log on properly, then you can see the PowerPoint that I'm showing everybody. And I'm not reading the PowerPoint. I'm speaking in addition to it. So when we're talking to devotees, devotees are going to be most likely to use the knowledge when they're convinced that it's true. And the way they're going to be convinced that it's true is to be convinced that what you're saying is actually from the Shastra. Now, anybody is going to be likely to apply what you're teaching only if they're convinced that it's true. Why should I apply something that's false? But especially if my audience is devotees, they're going to be convinced of the truth, not just through logic and reason, not just through examples and stories, but also you really have to show that your truth has a basis in Shastra. And I think that we've all had experience, again, sitting in classes where the person who's giving the class is saying some pretty interesting comments with no Shastric basis. And you're thinking, where is this from? And sometimes when you ask them, excuse me, where's this from? Really interesting stuff. And you can't get a Shastric answer. Okay, and the last maxim here, number 7, is we want to get from studying to obeying. Again, we want to get from theory to practice. All right, now we're going to go through how to do it. That's the basic theory behind it. Now we're going to get to the skill. So the first thing, step 1, is the spiritual knowledge itself. So we're giving this example of a verse. Right? This is just a sample. Supreme Personality of Godhead said, according to the modes of nature acquired by the embodied soul, one's faith can be of 3 kinds: in goodness, in passion, or in ignorance. Now hear about this. And here's an example where Krishna is doing that. He's explaining content. Let me give you the information. And let me make sure that the information is clear. So I'm taking the basic information, I'm expanding it, I'm clarifying it, I'm linking it perhaps to other places in the Shastra, I'm linking it to other commentaries of the Acharyas, I may be illustrating it with some real-world examples. I make sure that you know the Shastra. All right? This should be absolutely top 50%. My personal preference would be much less than that, something like 10%, although occasionally I get in a situation where it takes up to 50%. Okay, step 2. Now this is your key. This is your key. This is your key, and it's very important to understand this. Get the principle behind the knowledge. Get the principle behind the knowledge. Now, for every class you give, only one principle. For every class you give, focus on one principle. There can be sub-principles, subcategories, sub-subcategories, sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-subcategories, but there needs to be a unifying theme. That unifying theme should be able to be stated as one sentence of universal truth. And we're going to do this right now. I want to just go over the step on the slide. I'm going to go back to the previous verse, and I'm going to ask everybody here to contribute a possibility of a principle. So first of all, you want to be convinced that every verse in Shastra has at least one key principle. I'll tell you frankly, every verse of Shastra has at least 20. Most verses of Shastra have about 200. There's always at least one key principle in a verse and purport. Always. It's what is the essence, what is the universal truth. How do you do it? It takes time and effort. If I have the luxury, I will often look at a verse and purport a day or 2 or 3 before I speak on it, meditate on it, pray on it, and then go about my other services, and then come back to it. And I'll cycle through and do that repeatedly. And then sit down and take the time with it. Sometimes it takes a half an hour. Once you're good at this, you can find a principle in a verse and purport in 30 seconds. Although that's not my preferred mode. And then pray to Krishna. You ask Krishna, Krishna, please reveal not only what are the principles here, but which principle I should choose for this class that will be most helpful for my audience. It should be short and sweet, one sentence of truth. What you're looking for is a sentence of truth that has the potential of personal application and that's in line with the rest of the scriptures. All right, I'm going to ask for participation right now. So let's look at this verse we have up here. I'm going to read it again. And those of you who can't see it, you can turn, if you have a Bhagavad Gita handy, you can turn to chapter 17, text 2, just looking at the verse right now, not the purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, according to the modes of nature acquired by the embodied soul, one's faith can be of three kinds, in goodness, in passion, or in ignorance. All right, so let's look at what's the principle, what's the basic truth that's being given here. One could be, there are varieties of faith. And we can choose what kind of faith we want to have. Another can be that faith guides our decisions in life and is determined by how we associate with the modes. Another would be how we associate the modes determines what we strive for. Okay, I'd like to ask other people to please suggest some other principles in this verse.
Okay, for those, so I've unmuted people on conferencing. Please, I'm asking everybody to cooperate if there's background noise. But yes, go ahead if you'd like to add something.
We can have blind faith or maybe ignorant faith.
Okay, excellent.
Or our faith can be fickle-minded. Our faith can be flickering depending upon our desires.
Okay, so our faith can be blind, flickering, or maybe fixed depending on our desire. Excellent. Excellent. Don't be afraid of doing this wrong, by the way. If you're not willing to make a mistake, you can't learn anything. Somebody else.
How about what are the modes of nature and how do they apply to us?
Okay, but not a question. Give me a sentence. Give me a sentence that states truth instead of a question. The question is what you want your hearers to be asking.
Which mode of nature am I?
That's a question.
Oh.
A statement of
I'm
truth.
not good at this.
That's right. Keep trying. Keep trying. Don't give up. Try a statement of truth.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I haven't been listening because I got so many things going on here. But what about the way one sees the world is based on his action and his state of mind?
Excellent. Another one.
What was
faith is
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Rishab Dev.
faith only relates to the temporary existence, because it says that faith is only relates to our temporary existence as conditioned souls.
I'm not sure if we could state that as an absolute principle. We might be able to say conditioned faith. You might be able to say as an absolute principle, all conditioned faith is relative.
Right.
I don't think you could say all faith because there is transcendent faith. And like instead of that question, what mode am I in, it could be knowing what mode I'm in helps me to understand my goals. Do you see the difference between a statement and a question?
Yeah, I just guess I'm not good at
No, don't say you're not good at it. This is a skill. Whenever we learn a skill, it takes some time and it takes some false steps. It's always like that. You know, I taught this to hundreds of people, and maybe a fifth of them get it the first time.
I see here the Supreme Personality or Godhead said, so this means we need to follow authority.
Oh, wonderful. I was hoping that somebody would pick up something other than the modes in faith. Okay, so a principle we find here is that we need to follow authority. Very good. Somebody else.
It also highlights that soul is associating modes of nature.
Okay, but that's, give me something that's going to be useful for me. That's just information. That's not a principle. It's got to be something I'm going to be able to do something with. Can you try again? This is hard, by the way. This is not easy.
What I can do is like I can read further statements and understand my faith and understand the mode I am, and then in further chapters I can choose the mode I want to do.
Okay, good. Now get a principle behind all that. What's your principle? What's the truth that drive that?
My habits determine the mode, which determines the faith, which again determines my habits.
Okay, very good. That's a little expanded from this one verse. So you've kind of gone a bit beyond the verse, but that is definitely a principle.
I also seeing here at the end it says, now hear about it. So we have to be willing to hear.
I will put that, develop that a little bit more as a principle.
The whole process starts with hearing.
Okay.
Hearing to authority.
Yeah, we already said that.
Yeah, or you could combine that. You know, you could combine that. As I say, many times you'll find you can have sub-principles under the principles. Okay, we're going to go on. We'll get more practice, though. If you haven't practiced or you're still not sure that you know how to do this, you'll get more practice. All right. Now, the third step, first of all, very few people do that second step.
Mother Urmila, I need to interrupt. Why don't I go ahead and ask everybody to mute again because there's just too much background noise.
Okay.
Okay? So please, everyone mute.
Can I, Urmila?
Yes.
Can I throw one last one in there?
Sure.
According to our activities, our understanding and realization will change.
Oh, that's excellent. According to our activities, our understanding and realization will change. Excellent. Excellent. I want to really make the point that most preachers that I hear never get past step one, which is just explaining the content. They never focus on a principle. They don't have a theme. So you'll find that the class wanders all over the universe. And at the end, maybe you picked up a good point here and there. But if someone said, what was the class about, it's kind of hard to say. So to take that time to find the principle, to understand what is the principle, it is a statement. It's in the form of a statement. And it states a universal truth that has value and application to the lives of the people. All right, now step 3 is you're going to take that universal truth and bring it home. It's first I understand what the scripture is saying. Then I understand what is the principle behind what the scripture is saying. What truth is it pointing to? Remember, each verse has at least one principle. I commonly find at least 20, and I'm convinced, at least in theory, that there's at least 200 in every verse. So you're going to pick one. Always only pick one. Make that flashing neon lights. Only pick one. Then what does that have to do with me? Okay, let's say I took the principle that one should follow authority. If I want to understand what's going on in the world, I have to have the right authority. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said I can fix on that. What does that have to do with me? I want to explain, first of all, how the principle is true. I want to convince you that it's true. I'm going to spend some time convincing you that it's true in general. Soon after I moved into the ashram of the Chicago Temple in 1973, somehow or other the verses and purports were mostly about impersonalists and materialists. And pretty much every class was about what's wrong with the materialists and what's wrong with the impersonalists. And I would sit there in those classes going, why are they talking so much about impersonalists? Is that like some group over in India? And after 2 months, I finally realized, oh my God, they're talking about me. So in every class, what we want to do is first of all convince people of the basic truth of what we're saying. Why is it true that I have to hear from the right authority? Why can't I just hear from whoever I want? Why can't I just be my own authority? What's the necessity of having any authority? Then we're convinced that it's true in theory. Okay, all right, I accept that idea. But now, what does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with me? Let me see it in my life. Give me examples, give me analogies, so that I can actually see, oh yeah, I need to accept an authority. Not everybody else needs to accept it. Not just it's true in general. My goodness, it's also true for me. And stories, this is some way how to do that. How to bring it from a theoretical idea that I accept to something that I accept from me. Now again, I very rarely hear people do that. Then step 4, persuading. All right, I understand what the Shastra is saying. I understand the basic universal truth that underlies what the Shastra is saying. I accept that that truth is true. And I accept that it's true in general. And then I accept that it's true for me. Okay, now what do I do about it? So I'm sure we've all gotten to this point where we say, wow, I accept that this is true. Oh, wow, it's also true for me. Let me give you a simple example. So Srila Prabhupada in the Sastra often talks about the 4 defects of conditioned souls: to make mistakes, have a cheating propensity, to be illusioned, and imperfect senses. So first we say, oh yeah, that's true. It is true. Conditioned souls make mistakes, they cheat. God, so many people have cheated me, man. Yeah, I can tell you some stories about that. To be illusioned, to have imperfect senses. And then I bring it, wait a minute. It's also true about me. I'm illusioned. I cheat myself. I cheat others. I rationalize and justify. And I make mistakes. Those things apply to me. Wow, the world that I see and how I interpret it is different from the truth. I mean, I'll just tell you frankly for myself, I was chanting Hare Krishna and practicing Krishna consciousness for a long time before I finally understood, wait a minute, those 4 defects apply to me. I can't trust the information I get from my mind and senses that it's the same as reality. Wow. The reason that different people have different views of things is not because nobody's smart enough to see things my way and I'm the one who sees the truth, but because we're probably all seeing it wrongly. And it was groundbreaking for me. But then the next question is, well, what do I do about it? What do I do? How do I use this? I mean, I remember going to one of my graduate school classes where they were exploring different mental speculators. It was an awful class. We were talking about that how do we know that what we perceive is reality? Maybe this whole world is like a dream. Maybe our perceptions are not accurate. In fact, they said we can pretty much be guaranteed that our perceptions are not accurate. What do I do about it? Then you're just kind of hopeless. You kind of go home and say, wow, I can't trust my mind and senses. I can't even trust my motivations. What do I do? How do I deal with this so that I get proper guidance for action? Tell me what to do about it. And you want to speak in such a way that by the time you get to this presentation, your audience should be at the edge of their seats thinking, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Tell me. Tell me what to do. Tell me what to do with this. How do I use this? And then you've got to give them some guidance. Now, it's very important that when you get to this stage, and this is an art, just like understanding what a principle is and finding a principle, it takes some time and some practice to be able to do that easily and quickly. And in a similar way, being able to think of what ways your audience could apply the principle that you are talking about, that you're focusing on, also takes a lot of care and thought and practice and a lot of really trying to connect with Krishna in the heart. Now, there's two ways one can make a mistake here, and one is to be too specific. I was once in a class where the devotee said, so we should all read Srila Prabhupada's books for 2 hours a day. Now, that kind of application is so specific that there's going to be a lot of people listening who are just going to then dismiss the whole class. They're going to say, well, I don't have time to read Prabhupada's books for 2 hours a day, or that's not the way I prefer to read. I guess I can't do any of these things, and they'll get discouraged. Another way is just to be very vague and say, well, we should all be reading Prabhupada's books. Now, somewhere in the middle is we can make a determination starting today that I'm going to increase the quality and or quantity of reading Srila Prabhupada's books. Now, maybe I can take a vow to read a verse a day, or maybe during my reading time I can be taking notes, or I can be discussing with a friend. So you suggest a general thing, and then you can give some examples to give people the freedom to come up with solutions that are their own. All right, now this fifth step is ideal. I find that this fifth step is very difficult to do in most of the venues in which we are preaching Shastra. This fifth step is the kind of thing you can do if you're having ongoing classes with the same people, especially as part of a comprehensive seminar. Like, let's say you're teaching a Bhakti Shastri class for 4 months to the same people. And it's a shame because this is the kind of thing that really solidifies the teaching. This is the sort of step you can take also when you're not teaching a group of people, but when you're counseling an individual or a small group of people. And this is asking people to be accountable. So you say, all right, well, now that we've understood that we should hear from authority, now that we've understood how the problems in our own life come from when we're following our defective mind and senses instead of hearing from authority, and we've made a determination not to take our mind and senses and our opinions so seriously anymore, to realize that probably what we're seeing is not the truth. So I want to see, the next time we get in some conversation with someone about the Shastra says this or the Shastra means that, to step back for a minute and ask ourselves, am I really sure that this is what the Shastra says? Or am I sure this is the only thing the Shastra says? There could be many angles of vision. And I might be seeing the Shastra through my covering of the modes. Maybe I don't understand everything so well. Maybe it would help to have some Istagosti with other devotees where we can come up with the many angles of visions and get a more comprehensive view of the Shastra. Okay, so we give that as the possible application. Then if we have the ability to come back, we can ask people, so in the last week, did you get in any kind of Shastric discussion with? How many of you got in a Shastric discussion with someone? Okay. And what did you do? When you did that, were you able to be more open to the fact that your interpretation might not be the only correct one? What did you do with other people who thought that about their interpretation? Was there anybody that you talked to who was convinced that the way they understood the scripture was the only way to understand it? Were you talking to anybody who was convinced that they weren't understanding the Shastra, they knew the Shastra itself without understanding? How did you deal with that person? How did you think about that person? Did you have some compassion for them? We can discuss how we applied it. Another way you can do this is by asking people to have some sort of a buddy or partner that they work with. So we're saying, let's try to do this in our Shastric study. Act in such a way that we remember that we're conditioned by the 4 defects, that only Krishna is going to give us, only Krishna and his pure devotees are going to give us perfect instruction beyond the 4 defects. And I'm sure in the next week there'll be some opportunity where you're studying the Shastra, you're discussing some Shastra or philosophical point with others, and taking note of how well you deal with that and how well you really realize that the only absolute truth is coming from absolute authority. And then check in, if you're married, you can otherwise pick some other friend who's also here in the class and, check in next week before our next class and talk to each other about how you did. So you can also do that. I very rarely do this in a big class with people that I'm not working with regularly, but certainly doing this would probably double your effectiveness as a teacher and preacher. Sorry. I try to take out all this animation, but sometimes I forget. All right, what is going to maximize our effectiveness? What is going to maximize our effectiveness? Connect with Krishna through prayer, through meditation. Connect with Krishna. Be Krishna's instrument. It's only Krishna who knows what principle in the scripture you're talking about is going to be most important. Then, again, prepare your application to the real needs of the people you're speaking to. And that's another hour and a half seminar. Plan everything around the application. That's your hub. That's your hub. Start by finding the principle and how you want people to apply that principle, and have everything in the class point to that step by step. Everything in the class point to that step by step. What's the passage of Scripture? What's the principle? How do I personalize it? What will I do to persuade? And if possible, how can I make sure people are performing? Okay, so here we're going. We have to chant better. Give them some ideas. How can you chant better? Some illustrations are always helpful. And our time is less, but the idea of illustrations of history, personal experience, even imagination, and Shastra, when you say even imagination, like the Puranjana story, which is a fictional story, the reason that stories are helpful is that they give you a model for action. We could say, theoretically, this is how you can behave when studying the Shastra, to remember that you have the 4 defects and that we have to hear from authority. But if I tell you a story of someone who behaved like that, that's how I do it. That's how I do it. The psychologists have found that when we're listening to a story, that our mind behaves as if we are doing the activities of the person in the story. So if you take a jacket off and put it down, there's a certain thing that happens in your brain. If you read a story about someone who puts a jacket down, you do the same thing. And this principle is being used by sports coaches. So they have people mentally go through the steps of the sport before they physically do so. To employ an appropriate style when calling for commitment. Be careful. Know what kind of level of authority and relationship you have with people. Make sure that you're inspiring rather than commanding. Okay, and this is the last step, perform. If you can have people be accountable to their self, to their peers, to another person, to a teacher, or to Krishna. Again, I find that often in our class format it's difficult to do this. However, whenever you can do this, it really helps people. Okay, this is our formula. This is our formula. So let's say this together 3 times. Just the P words. Passage, principle, personalize, persuade, perform. Passage, principle, personalize, persuade, perform. Passage, principle, personalize, persuade, perform. Passage means you explain what the Shastra says. Keep that short. Principle, you find one principle and you explain how that principle is true. You convince people that that principle is true. Personalize, you convince people how that principle is true for me, for you, for each of us. Persuade, give people some guidelines as to how they can apply the truth of that principle in their own lives. Perform, give them some means of being accountable. Okay, we need everybody unmuted, please.
Okay. So go ahead, Prabhu, if you'd like to add. Everybody's unmuted.
Okay, we are going to go a little bit beyond 8:30. It took us about 15 minutes to get started, so we're going to have to go a little bit beyond 8:30.
Yeah, somebody just said, I can hear you, whoever that was.
Yeah, that's me, Sureshwara, here in Honolulu. Urmila Mata, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I was having a lot of technically with Skype and free conferencing, but I caught a lot of it. And
But we're not done, Prabhu.
Okay.
We're going to go through an exercise now.
Okay. So are you taking questions now? What's happening?
No.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Okay, I will go back on mute and keep listening.
Yeah, be unmuted.
Be unmuted. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Those of you who can see the screen, you can see the verse and purport we're using. If you can't see the screen, please open up to Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila, Chapter 8, Text 37. Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila, Chapter 8, Text 37. Here's the verse. You are the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. Therefore, no one can understand your purpose. By your mercy, you are touching me, although this is not sanctioned by the Vedas. Purport. A sannyasi is strictly forbidden to see the Vishayis, the materialistic people, but Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, out of his boundless and causeless mercy, could show favor to anyone regardless of birth and position. So here I've listed three possible principles. One is Lord Chaitanya's mercy is not dependent on our material qualifications. Another is Lord Chaitanya's mercy is above Vedic rituals. And another is we should not associate with materialists except to elevate them. Okay, now I want us to practice. We practice a little bit before we're going to do it again. Go to Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Text 28, Canto 3, Chapter 28, Text 37. If you can see the screen, it's right there on the screen. If you can't, you may have to get out a book. Srimad Bhagavatam 3, 28, 37. Verse. Because he has achieved his real identity, the perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting, just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. Purport. This stage of life is explained by Rupa Goswami in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. A person whose mind is completely dovetailed with the desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and who engages 100% in the service of the Lord forgets his material bodily demands. Okay? I'd like to ask everybody who's participating to please give one principle. It should be a statement, not a question, a statement of universal applicable truth.
Okay, I'll give if one is absorbed in spiritual consciousness, loses his consciousness of temporal things.
Okay, good. Next person. Please, everybody should participate in this. This is
one who has achieved his real identity, which is being the servant of Krishna.
It didn't sound like a complete sentence. You could say one's real identity is as a servant of Krishna.
Okay.
Okay. Next. This is hard, folks. Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Self-realization needs to achieve one's real identity.
Self-realization means to achieve your real identity. Okay, next. It'd be good, by the way, if you also write this down, because we're going to then take this to the next step and the next step. So whatever principle you're choosing, write it down.
Our awareness of our bodily demands depends upon our level of realization.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Next.
I have one. One
Yes.
who is self-realized has no other desire or need than to satisfy Krishna.
Very nice.
That's good.
Someone else. Even if you're not willing to say something in front of the group, at least write something down for yourself. Of course, the problem then is I can't check it. Somebody else. This is a learning lesson. Doesn't have to be perfect.
Well, it's in order to be free from bodily demands, you have to be engaged 100% in a Krishna service.
Very nice. They are very nice. Somebody else.
We need to learn how to dovetail everything for Krishna.
Okay, good. If that would even be better if you would have in that principle kind of the why. Why don't you work on that a little bit more? Work on that a little bit more and come back on it. Because I'm not, it is a universal truth, but you don't have within that principle anything that's a convincer. It's like you'd have to come up with something else that's a convincer. So if you could work on that a little bit and come back. Somebody else.
Our so-called bodily demands actually is superfluous to us because when we're absorbed in Krishna consciousness, we find we don't need them.
Wow. That's profound, isn't it?
I got one.
Okay.
One is fortunate if one finds a service that where he forgets his needs to eat or sleep.
Oh, very nice. You could also say our fortune is to find a service which will allow our minds to be completely dovetailed with the desire of the Supreme. Very nice.
I have something. What you just said it, actually. I wanted to say that we have to come to the state that we're not interested in our desires. We should be only interested in Krishna's desire.
Okay. Okay, somebody else. I know there's more people who aren't saying anything. Take a risk. Okay, at least everybody please have something written down because you have to use it. This is a class of skill, okay? So if we don't practice it, then it'll just be like, oh, that was interesting. This is something that one actually has to do. I mean, the best way to do this is to be in the same room. Okay, now we're going to go back to the sample we used of Madhya 837, and we're going to choose the third principle that we suggested. We should not associate with materialists except to elevate them. So now when you're giving the class, again, what you would first be doing is you'd be explaining the verse and purport a little bit. Then you'd be convincing people of the truth of the principle in a general way. Because before I'm going to accept it for me, I've got to accept that it's true in general. And remember, accepting that something's true for me requires a little bit of, how would you say, confronting my false ego. So if I say, oh yeah, materialistic people, they all have a cheating propensity, that's easy. If I say, I have a cheating propensity, that's really hard. So before you're going to convince me that I have a cheating propensity, you've got to convince me that conditioned souls all have a cheating propensity. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, the principle. First, we convince people of the principle. So here we're going to use as a sample principle, we should not associate with materialists except to elevate them. Now, how are we going to personalize this? So here we're giving one example. We could personalize that by saying that we could talk about how our association affects our consciousness, determination, and happiness. Some examples and stories. So, I talk about how people associate with materialists, Krishna Das associated with the Bhadaharis, Bomasurid associated with the demons, Jagai and Madai associated with those materialistic people, or, you can think of somebody you know, and they were a really nice person, and then they went to the university and they lived in the dorm, and pretty soon they were binge drinking, etc. And you go, wow, yeah, that association's really important. Then personalize. I think, now let's think about our own lives. Think about our own lives and how, sometimes you just walk in a room and you know that there's a fight been going on, or sometimes you're associating with you may have been really absorbed in Bhagavad Gita, and then you're with some people and all they want to talk about is the latest scandal. All right, so what I want everyone to do right now is take a minute and with the principle you had from the other verse, of 328:37, take that principle and write down something to personalize it. Now, I see what you have to write down. Look at the screen. Just a short thing here. Very short, 2 or 3 sentences. So take the time to write it down, and after you've written it down, some of you please share.
Okay.
Well, give everybody else a chance to write first before anybody shares. Give a minute or two for people to write. Okay, anybody would like to share?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I had a job, and they were with low-class people, and I saw...
is this the principle that you found from the other verse?
That we're talking about here? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Excuse me.
Okay, if you look at the screen, so I'm going through how to do it with one verse from Bhagavad Gita, and then with one verse, from Chaitanya Charitamrita. I'm modeling it from the verse from CC. Now I'm asking you to do it with the verse from Bhagavatam.
Okay.
Okay, so the verse from Bhagavatam about identity and mind dovetailed and intoxicated people, that verse, you gave a principle for that verse, which you should have written down. Take that principle, and how are you going to personalize it means, again, not personalizing it so much for you, but personalizing it for your audience. Now, you may do that to some extent with examples from your own life, but this is how you're going to personalize it for your audience. You want to make it real for your audience. So I'm glad you said that, because some other people might have also been confused. So those of you who can see the screen, we're continuing your work on 328:37. Take the principle you wrote down. How will you make it personal for your audience? Somebody ready?
The principle I gave was that self-realization means to achieve your real identity. And I would apply it by saying that the more identified I am with my body and its needs, the further away I am from being self-realized.
Okay. How would you make that so that when people heard that, that sounds like an expansion of the general principle. How am I going to, again, I'm going to emphasize, this is hard, people. Don't expect to get this right away. If you get this right away, you can all give yourself a gold star and a piece of burpee. Because this is hard stuff. It's not easy stuff. So how are you going to make that real for me? Okay, so I'll accept that in theory.
Okay.
That the more I'm involved with my bodily demands, the further I am away from my self-realization. All right, that would be a good way of explaining the principle in general. How are you going to make it real for me? Because I'm just going to nod my head and say, yeah, that's true. And I'm going to think that's true for everybody else in the class. Or I'm going to think that's true for all those hogs, dogs, camels, and asses out in the world. How are you going to make it so that when I'm listening to you, I come to believe that this is true for me?
Yeah.
Somebody else want to try?
For us.
Okay, I'm going to give it a shot here.
Okay, give it a shot.
Because I have understood that I am the servant of Krishna, although I might not be able to apply 100% in the service of the Lord, then I will encourage everybody to do as much as you can in accordance to your environment and your daily life. And if you cannot do 100%, do.
Okay, you're going into persuade. You're skipping the step. You're going to the next step. So you're already telling me to put this into action. So I'm still not convinced that it has to do with me. Convince me that it has to do with me. So you're what you have, you can save for the next step. You'll be ahead of all of us for the next step. Okay. Anybody else for personalize?
I think I have one, Urmila.
Okay, let's give it a try.
An example is Srila Prabhupada.
What was your principle again? Tell us your principle.
Pardon?
What was your principle again? Tell us your principle.
Oh, in terms of transcending the material body and the modes of nature we may be acting under.
Can you just read us your principle?
Oh, my original principle. When we self-realize there's no other desire or need than to satisfy Krishna.
Okay, that's the principle. And how are you going to personalize this? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was speaking of the example of Srila Prabhupada, that even though he was so ill on his deathbed, he still was transcribing right up to the end. He had no consideration practically for where his body was at.
Okay, that's excellent for illustrating the principle in a general way. So that's a really excellent thing that you would do to convince people that the principle is true. Okay, what we need now is it's not personalizing it, because I'm going to look at that and say, well, that's Prabhupada.
That's not me.
It's not me.
So you want us to give an example in our own lives, how we've experienced that?
It could be in our own lives, or to help people. What are you going to do to help people to see that it's true in their own life? Let's go back a little bit. I am going into 8:45. There's just no other. There's no way to do this fast in an interactive workshop, especially like this over the internet. Let's go back to my sample. Okay, and I'm going to give a real little mini class here so you can see how this is happening. Okay, I hope you can see the verse in front of you. It's Madhya 8:37. Right? So here we see that Mahaprabhu would generally be avoiding materialists, just like he was avoiding King Pragyaparudra, who was externally a materialist. And the only time he would associate with materialists was to help them in Krishna consciousness. And why is that? Because with whoever we associate with, so that was the passage that I just did. Now I'm moving on to principle. Because whoever we associate with, that affects us. I mean, you see it all the time. You see somebody, they're a nice kid, they come from a good family, right, very well behaved. Maybe we've even seen this with devotee kids. Then they go off to college, they're living in the dorm, and next thing we know, they're having illicit sex and taking intoxication. Right? I mean, we all have experience of this. Or we know somebody, maybe they were very degraded, and then they moved in the temple, and just by the association of the devotees in the temple, they were able to give up their bad habits. We see this. This is the principle behind the commercials on television, that if you keep watching the television commercials, you'll buy the product. I mean, everybody thinks, well, that's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to buy the product. But if it didn't work, nobody would spend billions of dollars on it. Okay, now I'm doing this as a real mini way. So right now I've tried to convince you of the principle. that the principle's true. So you're nodding your head and you're saying, yeah, people are really affected by their association. Not me, I'm not affected by my association, but those people, they're affected by theirs. I'm agreeing with that. Okay, now personalize. We might even think about this in our own life. I mean, if you remembered a time when you were really having a hard time, and just by being with the right kind of people, you were able to see the enthusiasm in your situation and get inspired to go on, something you couldn't have done by yourself, or where just because other people were inspired by a project, you also felt inspired. Now, like Narada, who was a little boy, and just by being with the Bhaktivedantas, he felt so inspired. I mean, we can try to think of that. Think about some time when just by meeting other people who were inspired, I became inspired, or the opposite. You know, sometimes you might think, well, this is true, this is really true, and you meet somebody who gives you some other explanation, and you think, oh, is this really true? I mean, I know that's happened to me. I remember a few years ago when it happened to me, when I was speaking to some devotee and said, look at this wonderful thing that I just read in the Sastra, and the devotee said to me, well, that's not right. Your understanding isn't right. That's not what Prabhupada says. Actually, Prabhupada says this. And then I started having some doubt. I'm thinking, did I really understand it? What is Srila Prabhupada really saying here? And I became very disturbed for a while. So I'm sure we can think of things like that. You know, where due to our association, we can be affected either positively or negatively. I mean, maybe some of us have even had some experiences in our association where we fell down from our vows. You know, Prabhupada talks about that. Someone else is smoking, and so you smoke. You know, you're visiting the relatives, and they're all watching some stupid movie, and just to be nice to them, you sit down and watch it too. Okay, that's personalizing. So I hope you all heard the different steps. I did the passage. Then I did the principle, where I explained the principle was true. And then I'm going to give examples or stories, or I'm going to ask people to think about things where they'll think, yeah, I have had that experience. I do have that experience. That's really true for me. Okay, anybody willing to try now with our verse, 328:37,
okay.
and your principle?
I'm willing to jump in.
Okay, good.
All right, so the principle was that if we become absorbed completely in Krishna consciousness, then we will realize that so-called bodily necessities were superfluous and had nothing to do with us. I have a similar experience. Once, because I was diseased, I had to fast for 3 weeks. And suddenly I realized that actually I didn't need food after that period of time. Up to that point I was almost like starving, but then suddenly I came to the realization I really don't need much food. And before then I was just kind of trying to control, but when I went cold to speak, I actually realized I didn't need in a similar way. That's what I could come up with. Okay,
very nice. How could you take from that now? Because probably most people have never fasted for 3 weeks. I think the longest I personally have fasted is about 36 hours. So how are you going to convince me that this is true for me?
Okay, well, even on, just stay with the example about fasting. I think most people will realize if they fast on an appearance day, like Janmashtami or something, it may be difficult, but if one gets through that, you can see that it wasn't actually that bad after all. You know, by the end of the night.
Okay. Another thing you might say is, have you ever had a time when you were so absorbed in service that you missed a meal and didn't even notice it?
Oh, that's good.
Okay. So because that's probably something, that's a good guess that that's something that everybody's experienced.
Yeah.
And you want to try to get, because we've all had such different experiences in life, you want to have a list of 5 or 6 different things like that you can bring up. So if there's someone who's listening who's never had that experience, you want to get something else that they have had. Okay, somebody else who'd like to try.
Okay, I can try. Until we attach to our desires, the principle, until we attach to our desires, we can't fully hear Krishna's, what Krishna is saying, Krishna's desires, and how we can check this, we can understand this if we dissatisfied. Always when we dissatisfied, it should be like an indication that we still have our material desires and we attach to something. Our dissatisfaction is indication.
Okay, that's kind of on the border. That's almost like a bridge, because I'm still hearing about it as a general truth. Help me to see what kind of experiences might I have had where I would have seen that that was true in my own life, where I would have actually said, oh, yeah, I did have that experience. Now I can understand it. See, what you're doing in personalizing is you're giving people the key to understand something that they've already experienced. You're connecting this truth of my feeling of satisfaction being related to whether it was my desire or Krishna's desire to something I've experienced. So you might say something like, perhaps you've had some time where you felt overwhelmingly satisfied in Krishna's service, and you realize, wow, this was because I was working for the satisfaction of Krishna instead of myself. And you might have been doing something that normally you wouldn't like at all. Maybe you were cleaning the toilets.
Mm-hmm.
But because you were doing it for Krishna and Guru, you felt so satisfied. So you want to do like people go, yeah, I have had that experience. Oh, that's why. You want a little light to go on in people's heads. Oh, that's why I had that experience. That's what that experience I've had means. First you're giving the general truth, and then you're showing how that truth provides meaning, provides the understanding for something that I've experienced. Okay, anybody else like to try? You can see why most people who give class never do this. All right? You all know how hard this is. Yeah, go ahead.
When one is absorbed in devotional service, one forgets his bodily demands.
Okay, that's
an
your
example is, have you ever experienced serving prasadam to all the devotees? You haven't eaten yet, and yet at the end you're completely satisfied and you're not even hungry.
Cool. That's wonderful. 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 That's the kind of thing that we want in this personalized step. And you want to try to pick, again, don't just pick one example, because it could be that some people have had that experience and some haven't. So in the personalized part of your class, you want to have a number of examples that are likely, so that at least one example will relate to everybody in your audience, probably. You know, you got to do as best that you can. Okay, one more person.
I got one.
Yes.
Okay, the principle is devotees are fortunate if they become so enlivened in service that they forget eating and sleeping.
Okay.
So then I'll go to a personal experience. I had such an experience orchestrating a diorama project in the Long Building at Mayapur, where I was so absorbed that I simply didn't have time to eat or sleep. And then I expand that to many devotees in the early days of the movement went on marathons either to distribute books or to prepare their temples for Srila Prabhupada's arrival. And they forgot, they didn't have time also to eat or sleep. And there's a certain kind of ecstasy that goes along with that. And a lot of the devotees experience that, and there's some kind of a taste for doing that.
Okay, very good. And you probably you might want to consider taking it a little further and saying, I'm sure each of us have had some time in our life like that. Maybe it was just one day, maybe it was a week, maybe it was several years, where we were so absorbed that we were able to forget eating and sleeping. Okay, we're going to go on. Okay, now we're going back to my sample. Madhya-lila 837. So again, the principle was we should not associate with materialists except to elevate them. Then we're going to telling some stories about where people can consider how that was operating in their lives. Now we're on to the persuade. Okay, so you can shift your mind back to this. So remember we were talking about personalized. Have you ever found you did something you didn't want to do just because other people around you were doing it? Or did you ever find you did something for Krishna that you never would have done on your own because other people around you were doing it and you were like, wow, this is great. Okay, now to persuade. And if you can see my screen, I'm going to be reading my screen. Think of one way in which you now associate with material if it's harmful to your advancement, or think of one way in which you can improve your association with devotees. We can make a specific plan to improve that association today. So I can say, okay, now let's think of, is there something in our life, is there something in my life where I'm doing something that I'd really rather not be doing? And is that due to some association? Am I allowing myself now to associate with some people or some media that is getting me to behave in ways that I really don't want to do? I mean, it might not be something gross like, I'm going out and drinking beer, but it might be that I'm treating people disrespectfully. Maybe I'm speaking in a nasty tone of voice to the people I live with because I'm sitting around watching television where people are swearing and cursing at each other. And maybe that association is affecting me. Or, I might think about something I'd like to do, something I'd really like to do that I haven't been doing, and think, if I wonder who I could associate with who's doing that, who could inspire me to do it. I had one friend who was suffering with a lot of physical disabilities and diseases and really wanted to get involved in some service. And she ended up associating with people who were doing a very big project, and she was helping out with it a little bit. And that gave her the confidence that even though I have so many physical disabilities, there's something that I can do. There's something I can do. It changed her whole view of herself and her whole view of Krishna consciousness. So we could think about maybe something maybe something today for the rest of the day. It's still early in the morning here at least. Something for the rest of the day or something tomorrow. That how could I use this idea of association to help me do something that I'm not yet doing, or help me to give up something that I'm doing right now? Now we can make a plan. We just choose one thing and come up and make some plan. But how am I going to, what kind of person am I going to look to associate with, or what kind of association am I going to give up? Okay, so that's an example of persuade. Now you can't persuade until you've done the other steps. Okay, I'm not going to be able to persuade anybody that they should make a change in their association unless they're first of all convinced that association is important in general, and then if they're convinced association is important for them. Okay? Okay, now we're going back to the verse that all of you guys are working on, which is Bhagavatam 3:28-37. You now should all have a principle. You now should all have found a way to personalize the principle. Now, what are you going to ask people to do? What are you going to ask people to do? Not too specific, not too general. Some examples.
I got one.
Please take, okay, just give people 1 or 2 minutes to write something down, and then we'll ask people to share. Thank you all for tolerating trying to do this over the Internet. I've never tried to do an interactive workshop over the Internet before, so Ramananda had to spend months convincing me. Okay, somebody ready to share?
Yeah. It's very short.
Short is good.
Everyone needs to find some service to Guru and Gauranga that will inspire them. They have to find that in the association of others that also inspire them. And this can even be over the Internet.
Right. The way you've stated it is as a truth rather than as an action. So if you just slightly were to change the words and say, let's see if we can make as a priority in our lives, and you want to give it the time bound and don't make it like a year. I never say more than a week. But each of us, it might really be helpful for each of us to make as a priority sometime in the next few days to look at the service we're doing in the Association of Devotees and seeing, have I found that service? And if I haven't, maybe that needs to be one of the main things that I look at. So you want to take it from, really giving people some action plan. to do that. Okay, somebody else.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
Okay.
The principle was if we're absorbed in Krishna consciousness 100%, then we realize that bodily necessities we're superfluous. The example was about just like if we become absorbed in the service, then sometimes we'll forget we even ate or slept, just absorbed in it. So the next time we do something as simple as chanting our japa, we should make sure that we turn off the computer, don't answer the phones, whatever is necessary so we have absolutely no distractions. And then after being absorbed like that for 2 hours, then we can evaluate, did I really miss anything?
Whoa. That was very nice.
Yeah, I'll have to do that sometime.
That was very nice. Okay, that was a good action plan. It was specific enough so that we could do it, and general enough so that it would be a rare person who'd say, well, that doesn't relate to me. And you might want to give another sample or two, because just in case there's someone in your audience who, they have such a life that they're always chanting their japa on the train going to work. So you might want to have at least one other possibility, because that is somewhat specific. But that was really good. That was really good. That's the kind of thing, people are going to walk away from a class like that and saying, okay, this is how I can apply what I just heard today. Somebody else. And all glory to those of you who have the courage to speak up in front of everybody and have me even correct you.
No, that's the fun part.
That's the fun part, okay. Anybody else?
I can try.
Okay.
We not only have to choose our...
Tell us your principle. At least tell us your principle again.
Okay, I maybe changed now because you gave the idea about association, but if you want me to stick with that, I can. And I have
otherwise too confusing for us. Okay, somebody else?
I'm not. I think so.
Okay, well, let's have courage and give it a try.
When one is absorbed in devotional service, one forgets his own mind and bodily demands. For example, serving prasadam, how you feel so satisfied that you're not even hungry
when
you've completed it. Why is this? Because Krishna is pleased when I serve the devotees, even more than when I serve him, when he is served directly, not when I serve him, but when he is served directly.
Okay.
So my call to action would be for us to each go out of our way to serve another devotee. Maybe you can't do it every day, but if someone calls you and they don't have a ride to the temple, go out of your way, serve them. I haven't developed it any further.
Good. You got there, yes. Not developed, but you have the right idea. You have the right idea, and you want to make sure you're including the principle there. Go out of your way to serve them, and then you'll see that as you do that, you forget yourself, and you get that absorption. Very good. Anybody else would like to try? We're a little bit after 9 o'clock here, so we could have one more person. Okay, let's go on. I don't think that we really have time for this discussion, but you can just take a look at this for a minute. If you can look at your own classes and see how much of your classes are devoted to application. You can also start noticing other people's classes, how much they're dealing with application. My suggestion to you is that between now and next week, that you go through this process in writing at 3 times. So take some verse from the Sastra, figure out the principle, how you would explain the truth of the principle in a general way, how you would bring that to people's own lives, and what you would ask to persuade them. And you might even practice giving the class yourself, not in front of an audience, maybe with a tape recorder. but at least go through this in writing 3 times. Next Saturday, the seminar is going to be quite different. So in this seminar, we've given you an overall structure. Passage, principle, personalize, persuade, perform. Passage, principle, personalize, persuade, perform. Passage, principle, personalize, persuade, perform. That's your structure. What we're going to be doing next week is at a more advanced level. We're going to be, and next week's is going to be based on the book Made to Stick. We're going to be going over what are the elements of a presentation that make it memorable and that make it usable. And then you'll be using those elements throughout the 5 parts of your structure. So we're going to keep the structure. We've got the skeleton now. Next week we're going to be adding the blood and the flesh and the muscle and all that other good stuff, the nerves. So I want to really thank all of you for having the patience to go to an internet workshop. Interesting. And I want to especially thank those of you who had the courage to submit possibilities and have me sometimes say, well, maybe you could tweak it a little bit here or there, because that's not always the easiest thing to do. So it's after 9. I think we have to end here. Thank you all. Glorious to Srila Prabhupada.
Thank you.
Nice, Prabhupada.
Thank you.